Welcome to Turek Books podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Joshua Turek. We're never going to read all the books we want, but when someone tells us about a book, that's its own valid form of experiencing it. Our guests come in to talk about the books that left lasting marks on them as readers, and that becomes a springboard to who they are, who I am, and maybe who all of us are. So sit back, relax, and enjoy it. And who knows, maybe you'll end up grabbing a book or two. Maybe you've read some of them, and it's nice to hear someone else talk about them. We want this to be like a book club, but without the guilt. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Turek Books. I'm extra excited for our guest today. He's someone, when you have a conversation with the person, oftentimes you adopt a certain, hey, let's figure out the world together kind of response to how you engage with them. And truly one of my favorite people to do that with has joined us today. He's my friend. He's also my manager. He allows us into this cavern of podcasting. But more importantly, I just really enjoy figuring out the world with you. And I think we're going to.
That's exciting.
Drew Shenfield.
Hey, that's really exciting. It's fun. I was thinking about the books I was bringing, and it's really, or the books I wanted to talk about, and it really did come down to stuff where it was like, what is the world like? I was truly thinking, what are the things that I'm reading, and I'm obsessive about reading about either stuff of like inward world figuring out, or like really weird but like really aggressive like external history figuring it out.
And where did you land?
I landed in the middle. Because the first book I recommended to you, I think it was like we were biking back from a volleyball game.
Yeah, that's how we met. We met at a beach playing volleyball on Manhattan Beach, and we were both the only two who rode our bicycles there. And we tethered our bicycles to one another.
I don't have a bike lock. I still don't.
Yeah, you ride lighter. Yeah. I come loaded with like Trader Joe's snacks, a basket, sunscreen if I can remember it.
I'm like always whenever I go someplace, I'm like, can I put my bike in there? And people are like, I'm like, thank you.
It's a conversation starter.
It's also like a core identity thing for me now of like any conversation I have, people are like, oh, do you bike? But I recommended you The Will to Change, Bell Hooks.
Yes.
And that was funny because I think I was going through a book reading phase of like, what's going on? What's in my head? How do I figure it out? And then that book was kind of like, oh, I got it. Like it was truly like almost didn't need to read another book.
Wow.
About, internal machinations of patriarchy and how it affects, I don't know, any guy going through life in a really simplistic way where it was like boiled down to, hey, it's really hard. You got to do your best to make it better for other people, and you have to give yourself some slack to get to a place to go do that.
Yeah. No, and I mean, that's how our relationship began. It wasn't any kind of professional thing. It was just recommending books to each other. And you recommended that Bell Hooks book to me, and I was blown away for the same reasons. How empathetic it was. It wasn't like, you're the bad guy and here's how you need to change. It was just like, hey, here's how this like patriarchal capitalistic system is affecting all of us.
Yeah.
And how it's limiting us from actually loving each other more. And like you're basically, so you were on a self-help journey, and then Bell Hooks just shut down the self-help section.
Yeah.
She's putting self-help out of business.
It really was so instant. I wish I brought like quotes from it, but it was so instantaneous getting it where I was like, oh, that all makes sense. And there's something so I think like there's always this idea of like, what does the revolution look like? And it's so structurally oriented of like, well, we could do, but it's like, it starts with such an internal conversation and such an internal dialogue. And I think Bell Hooks is such a revolutionary writer in the sense of like, well, this is what it can look like. This is what you are working for. This is what you're, at least aspiring to be, instead of, I think, where some people are like, burn it all down,
mm-hmm.
which I fall into a lot. But
yeah, it's an easy solution to burn it all down, but is it really? And is it humane? And is it like, you're just like responding to a world of violence with like this sort of like, let's start over thing. And it's like, well, no, Bell Hooks kind of weaves you into this idea that like, no, we are kind of there. It's just like we keep taking these.
Yeah, what are the little things that you can twist, and like what are the conversations that are happening in your head that like you take. I always think of it where people go, it's like, well, they're doing this, or and I'm like, who's the them? Who's the there? And it's so it's like literally a voice in your head that's talking about it, that's going through these things of like, this guy cut me off in traffic, I need to like jump out of my car and dominate him, and the person just driving by.
Yeah, just these like ultra extreme responses we have because they've been like programmed into us.
Yeah, programmed, and also it's like the idea of just such a competitive environment, and it's such a normal talking point. It's such a normal thing in culture in general of like people being like, well, it's cutthroat out there, and it's like, is it really aren't we like in a land of abundance? How does so few of it come? Why is it so competitive when it's like, well, if I'm just nice to myself, and then in turn I'm nice to the people around me and the women in my life, and how does that actually like make a more, lasting effect than being like, I'm going to beat everybody?
Yeah. Well, there's this strange schism that I've read about where like, yeah, we're cultured to be a man of values inside our home with our family, whatever. And then the second we step out the door and get past our neighbors who we're supposed to love, suddenly it's like, no, it's about drives and how motivated are you and how productive are you, and that's like a really schizophrenic way to sort of live your life.
Yeah. It's like it's also, you're so fed. I mean, I love hustle culture content just because it's almost like there is no satire left in the world anymore. We're stuck living in satire. So it's like you're watching something come on the feed, and it's like, this is how I break my day up into like, how do I have 3 days in one day? And it's like, I wake up at 3. I'm like, you're sleeping 4 hours a night. There's something going on. But I think I think it's also all of that stuff too is like a kind of regurgitation down of I go back to this thing of like, well, you really are in this crazy culture. Like, it's such a crazy culture. It's like you take a step back and you get a little sensibility of like, wait. So it's like, I need to have 2 jobs, 3 jobs. I know so many people that have 2 jobs where it's like you are working in between multiple gigs. You're stringing it all together, and I'm like, yeah, it's like I show up. It's a really intense setup, I think.
Well, and then that time you do have at home, it's real difficult to take that setup off and not still be like, okay, then I'm home. I make my smoothie at 4 to 5 a.m. I do my 18 minutes of meditation, and it's like that programming. It's like even in the the self-care portion of the hustle culture is still like so damning. And it's like you're maybe as more sped up as you ever have been. Applying that like outer drive even into your home, it's like you've been invaded. Yeah. And then it's like, what about if we tried with bell hooks? It's like, what if we took our values that we're supposed to have in the home, hopefully, and then apply those out into the world too? Was sort of one of my interpretations of it.
Same here. I also am I'm like the most easily influenced person in the entire world. And so it's like I am like, like I see some guy eating like 30 eggs a day, and he's like, this is going to get you absolutely shredded. It's like the equivalent of taking low doses of steroids. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll give that a go. I'll crush like 300 eggs in 10 days. And I'm like, I don't feel good. What's going on? Like what? And so I think I'm always in flux of needing a little bit of a North Star. And so it's always a little bit of like a check-in place for me to be like, okay, I need to get back to this, like this little internal peace, like giving yourself the space. And how do you even build that like garden inside of yourself where it's like you're going out into this world that's constantly, buy, consume. I'm not working hard enough. Like I should get a second gig, or like, oh my God, I just got like an Uber advertisement of like, you can make an extra, $300 a week by driving. And I'm like, wait. How do I actually have a little bit of solace to that? And I do think it's like it's so proliferated because it's not a symptom, but it's like what the sickness is, I guess. It's like that's kind of the seeped into the brains of so many people where it's like I don't know. I think that's where I go back to that, like the construction of like the why of the world. Why does the world work that way, or how does it work that way? And it's just like, that's the system. It's like, oh, it's actually, it's legislated. It's actually just, that's how it works. It's like the whole point of this is to be better at providing goods and services to an extent that's, minus the human person. And I think the one thing that reading The Will to Change more than anything else is being like, oh, I am a person. Like I am a person in a system, and maybe I've lost some of that personhood. And I'm like, and part of me too is like, maybe I didn't have any of this guidance to even lead me to personhood. And you turn to this book, and it's just giving you some of the breadcrumbs to be like, okay, here's a little bit of a blueprint on how to get back to it. Which I really, I don't know. I think it's one of my favorite books.
Mine too. I think it was the year 2022, and it was like my favorite book that I read that year, and the first one you recommended me, which like what a strong intro to a person. I'm like, all right, this guy's good. But also like you were saying earlier, like, oh, you wish you'd brought it in to read passages. It's so true in a sense that like I couldn't quote you any of the passages from that book.
I almost feel embarrassed talking about it. Like, I really do. I'm like, oh, like I shouldn't be. I shouldn't.
It's my favorite book. What'd she say again?
Yeah. No, it's almost like she said some really good stuff. Like,
I did yell at someone who got in the way of my bicycle today, but but the feeling remains. Like we could both look at each other and be like, yeah, that book shifted something in me, and I know what that thing was. It was like, hey, you've been conditioned to be sort of a toxic person in a toxic world, and maybe there's like ways to find relief from that, and maybe those ways don't even involve self-punishing and thinking of yourself as the worst person in the world, but just kind of going, oh yeah, how can I be a more empathetic and open person? Yeah. And that was my takeaway from it.
And I think that's exactly what it was for me too, because I 100%, like, because it's such a, I don't know, it's just a really good jumping off point for that type of discovery in yourself. Where you're like, I kind of was like a shitty dude. Maybe I shouldn't be as shitty anymore.
Yeah. Like if like you had to go to school for being a dad. Yeah. It's like, wouldn't you wish you could give every dad that book? Yeah. And I mean, what a great compliment to that book.
Well, there's also, I mean, I think that leads that to that thing too of like, that book fills in a lot of places too of like people I'd want to give that to is like conspiracy theorist, where I'm like, and that's the second book I was going to talk about was the Jon Rosenthal.
Oh, Jon Ronson.
Jon Ronson.
Are you talking them?
Yeah. Where I'm like, there's so many times where that book's so illustrative of such great, because it's pre-2001, it's pre-9/11, and Jon's infiltrated all of these like festering holes, and it's people that are so motivated by capturing something. Like that's the thing, or identifying something against them. And I think about it where I'm like, what if like you gave that book to Alex Jones before he like went off the deep end, and he was like, oh my God, maybe it's like a personal discovery I have to do.
Maybe the world's not against me. Maybe I'm against me.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, that's so, and he did such a good job of infiltrating those groups, those extremist fringe groups that are now not fringe anymore. It's like really like a blueprint onto, okay, this is where there's this lead into thought that is now so prevalent, and almost like so prevalent to the point where it's like you can't really tell conspiracy from non-conspiracy anymore, or where does it come from, and he does such a good job of really getting into the weeds of like, okay, here's the leader of the KKK trying to like make it more PC so people can digest it, and he's got like a Woody Allen sense of humor in a weird way, and it's like, and you're like, oh, okay, so there's some watered down version of extreme racism that's entered into society, and these guys are bubbling up with hate, and he's just sitting there being like, he's also like a Jewish guy,
Yeah.
and they're saying the most horrible things, and he's like probably afraid for his life figuring that out. And I'm like, oh, this is so fascinating, because there's also stuff I think in that book that you see parroted more and more nowadays, where you're like, oh, this is there was a small subset of people with fringe beliefs that really believed, that really were like filled with hatred in extreme ways, and that type of stuff has been seeping into American politics, and to see that stuff play out. And then also I see a lot of people say stuff where I'm like, oh, actually, if you knew where that came from, if you knew the I guess the seed of the ideology that you're preaching now, you might rethink it. It might reformat some of it. And some of that stuff is like both on both sides of the aisle, surprisingly, where it's like you don't really think about, I don't know, I have some pretty, it's actually fringe beliefs, but my fringe beliefs of it are like, you go to that stuff and you have like, the Sierra, or what is it, the Sierra Club?
The Sierra Club?
Yeah, which is like one of the most like
prominent environmental organizations,
and one of the most problematic beginnings of an organization. And a lot of the literature of like,
how did it begin?
Basically being like, we need to save like space for white people.
Right.
And then a little bit
That's
of
sort
like,
of not in my backyard
oh,
mentality.
yeah. And then also like, I mean, a lot of environmental work is like, from fringe eugenicists that are like, if you read like a lot of early 2000s, or if you think about growing up and you think about like, what's the number one cause of like pollution in the world? What's the number one environmental problem in the world?
And like what they told us as
growing,
kids,
yeah.
I think they would be like littering or something, or the oil companies, or I don't know. What do you?
I think they were. I think it was overpopulation.
Yes, that was a big one.
So it was always overpopulation, but it was like, where was the overpopulation a problem?
Right, and it was in like non-white countries.
It was like in third world countries, where it was like you're getting indoctrinated into thinking like, oh, we need to like spread like safe sex practices
right
to these places to stop, because it's like and you go further back into it, that's kind of like the basis of a lot of weird environmental stuff, which I think it's a double-edged, it's a really tricky thing.
I was reading something recently too, and it was very much about like part of that Nazi movement in Germany. It was like this rewilding white fairy tale, like living in the forest kind of mentality that, that's really interesting. Well, reading Mike Davis, he talks about, these like conventionally like wealthy white people will build their nice community up against a mountain way up a paved private road, and then be like, oh yeah, we need to protect the mountain now. Yeah. And it's like that. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's exactly that. And then it's also just like the idea of, I don't know. I think it's that idea, and then it's other stuff of like people like white replacement theory, like that type of stuff of like, where I'm like, oh, there's actually there's these really core, interesting, hateful things in human culture in generally that pop up, and they get regurgitated into things, and those things I think can get reversed engineered really quickly in really insane ways. Yeah. And you see the edging of stuff, or the edging of ideas that are, I think if you were like in 20 years ago and you think about some of the stuff that we're talking about today, it's like, oh, it only took 4 years for us to have like for Democrats to have a more aggressive border policy than Trump did 4 years ago, right? So it's like you just see this edging into stuff where you're like, what you're watching it and you're thinking, am I? It's like it's so gradual, it's almost unnoticeable until I think it starts happening.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's what that book Them kind of hits on.
Yeah.
Is like, it's been happening for generations, but then what you're talking about, this current moment of like subtle propaganda, it came from some kind of intense places. And Ronson does a good job in that book of like sort of non-judgmentally embedding himself with these people and sort of getting to what you were talking about as it related to Bell Hooks, which is just like, these are suffering people on an individual level, and the way they've taken in the world and then reprojected it out is a manifestation of their pain more so than it is their ideology. Because the KKK leader has this Jewish journalist following him along, and he's like totally pleasant to him, you know.
They're friendly.
Well,
that's the other thing of
him having the Woody Allen sense of humor is like
really funny.
Yeah, really funny.
It's really funny. And then there's the same example of the Islamic extremist that is in the UK calling for basically calling for terrorist attacks pre 9/11, being on all these watch lists, and then talking to John so openly and honestly about being like, the West is ruining the world, and then watching The Lion King with his son,
right,
and being like, we love The Lion King,
right,
we love this,
right. And
so you're like, oh, these are people that are really grasping at some who do feel either really wronged, or they're really troubled, or they're in a battle against themselves in an aggressive way. And I think that's the
And then
That's
like that like pain has nowhere else to go but extremism. You know? It's like, yeah, The Lion King, beautiful story. It does draw from stories around the globe, you know, a certain universal myth. And, you know, but came through a Western, you know, entertainment companies, whatever. But then, yeah, like the United States military industrial complex, yeah, that's kind of ravaging a lot of people's communities. So, you know, it's
well, it is. It's so funny. I'm watching the X-Files a lot recently, and the X-Files, and this is why it just makes me think of it, because it's like that. It's just on conspiracy. I think a lot of things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and this is like all the books that kind of go into it and the stuff is, and why I wanted to start with Bell Hooks, because I needed to center it for myself, because I was like, okay, it's got to be a little bit of a moment of like, okay, this is the revolution happens inside, but there's so much systematic forces that are like truly legislated. You could pull up documents from 1971 of like Lewis Powell, you know, soon to be future Supreme Court justice, saying, how do we get humanities out of college and replace it with business? How do we turn the tides and make companies allow companies to influence politics? It's important. It's fundamental, because at the time they felt that people were being serviced too well by the government. And so it's like you have this history that goes into, you know, like corruption laws that are, you know, two months ago, it's the Supreme Court's deciding if it's like between gratuity and bribery, what's right and wrong. And then you go back further into like 1917, and you have, I've talked to you about this, but it's like the Espionage Act that over the last 10 years has basically been honed into this thing to basically prevent any government leakers. So it's like, even if the government's doing something that you don't necessarily, that the people don't want, there's no way, there's no one who's gonna be like, hey, I think it's really important. The last person, Edward Snowden, who did it, is like still out in the run. And I don't think people talk about that, where I'm like, oh, you guys remember that like every single thing, every single phone call, every single text message, there's no privacy, that we live in a non-private state. And so I think about that, and I'm like, well, if you're living in a country shrouded by secrecy, and maybe that's what was happening in late 1990s, early 2000s, where these people are looking around and they're coming up with conspiracy theories because like, something's off. And this is where the X-Files, I think, is also the iteration of that, because it's them coming up with them talking about like the covert CIA, and it's like they mention some operation, and then I'll Google it, and I'm like, oh, that's real. Like they're actually like, how are they doing this on Fox Broadcasting, calling it out, where you're just like, oh, this is it's it's a ripe environment. It's hard to imagine this environment that we live in and not being a fertile place for conspiracy theories. Because what else are you going to do to grasp onto it? And I think that's like the basis of a lot of stuff. It's like you're living in the poorly. It's like education's hard to come by. People are fried on social media. I'm easily influenced. I'm watching stuff and I'm having to check in with myself. And I've started reading more because I was like, I need to grasp stuff a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah, 100%. And like, talking about the just sort of the conversations right now, they're so splintered and they're so anything goes as long as you like firmly believe in it and other people believe in it. And the seedlings of them that, like you said, pre 9/11, so pre like social media, but the internet's like starting to rise and bubble up and people are able to talk to each other a little more. And so, suddenly like a lot of the stuff that's been in the dark comes out. But then with like I say, today's conspiracy is tomorrow's declassified report. Yeah, and it feels like that. Like we've seen enough evidence now where we're like, our government did engineer a coup in Central America.
Well, that's the thing that I was looking back at, where it's like, again, I feel like my reading has gone from being like bell hooks to a little bit of nonfiction to like university professors and their dissertation on like the Espionage Act. But it's like what is it, Operation Cyclone, where it's like the U.S. government is funding groups in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, to overthrow the government that's like Soviet controlled now. So you have this giant proxy war that starts playing out in the Middle East, and it's like we're here 50 years later still dealing with the ramifications of it, and now also trying to like pass a little bit of blame on who how, what's right, what's wrong. And it's such an interesting thing to have these moral conversations about influence, where I'm like, well, if this stuff has been, even goes back to, there was the Pentagon Papers, I think it was called, in 72, where there was a whistleblower, Michael, I'm blanking on his name, but he worked for the government, got moved over by the anti-war movement, was really at a kind of like a crisis of faith of what he was doing, steals a bunch of documents, and it's like revealed that it's a small group of people in a room somewhere that have decided, hey, this we gotta intervene in this Vietnam stuff. Like, something's gotta happen. It's not a it's like, at what point is it like, oh, you're being a conspiracy theorist? You're like, well, I'm actually taking a look at a pattern of how conflict starts. Right. And that's kind of there's a pretty simple blueprint for it that gets slowly revealed. And I go back to the thing. That's the system. That's what we live in. That's what we're doing. I kind of think it's almost stupid to be like, we got to change it. We got to do it. Because it's like, there's the mechanisms that are at play of it are so monstrous and ingrained. It's a tough thing to wrap your head around fully.
Yeah, the information we receive is so layered. Yeah. And who we think we're getting it from, there's like so many levels behind that. And and you bringing up X-Files, like, how are they able to name these conspiracies these events that really happen? And it's like, because that strengthens the idea that these are kooky conspiracies because it's on Fox X-Files. So you can disregard that, or you're going to be a tinfoil hat guy because now you're just quoting a TV show on Fox. Yeah. But it's like, no, that in and of itself is part of the...
I do think there's something about, really smart Hollywood writers where I tip my hat to them, where they're like, we're going to sneak it in weird ways. Like, I think they do it in... I think that's my one thing where I'm like, people are kind of like, okay, we should just say this now and have that be part of the lexicon of conversation when people are talking about stuff. And I think that's, I think it's read twofold, where someone is like, I'm gonna go to the library and look this up. Yeah. Or they're like, that's crazy.
Yeah. Well, you brought up the Afghanistan thing, and there's that great Adam Curtis documentary, Bitter Lake. Yeah. And he explores.
Adam Curtis is if anyone hasn't checked out an Adam Curtis doc and wants to like fry your brain for a couple hours.
Yeah, on the present, the modern condition. I mean, I've only just been introduced to him this year, so I've gone through like 3 or 4 of them. They're all on YouTube. I feel like Adam Curtis is like the number one filmmaker we can talk about on this book podcast.
Yeah.
Because it is literary what he does. And he has all that BBC archival footage that he uses, so it's so effective.
I feel like he writes an essay and then he's like, what can I put on top of it?
Yes.
How do I find, it's almost like writing an essay instead of having footnotes. He's like, here are my references. Here's the video to go along with what I'm saying. And I think that's a really interesting, convincing format.
Yeah. I mean, especially because he's such a good writer, and he plays with the information. He doesn't follow a perfectly straight line. Actually, JT Parr, his episode of this podcast, I think he was the first one who brought him to my attention, and then very shortly after, a bunch of other people kept mentioning Adam Curtis, so I was like, okay, I gotta
do a deep dive.
Yeah, but yeah, I know the world we're living in. I mean, you know me, I went through a nice edge of conspiracy for a while, maybe like a year ago. And now I don't feel like conspiratorial in the sense, because I feel like they just keep saying the quiet parts out loud. Like there's no fear of repercussion. I came across this poll the other day. I think it was like public opinion has no influence on the United States governmental policy from the top down. Maybe at a local level it does, but this was like speaking to like the federal government.
That's awesome. That's really cool. It really is. Like it's really amazing. Like when you really think about the leaps and bounds that we've had to go to get to that moment, it's like there's a lot of hard work.
They've done a great job.
They've done a really good job.
They've gotten so good at what they do that they don't fear us in any way.
They're like, shut
we are
up.
byproducts. And then a friend sent me a political commercial he was working on. He was just asking if I knew anyone who'd be right for it. And so I read the article that accompanied it, and it was this, I think it was a California Democrat, and he basically is quoted saying, people don't vote for policy anymore, they vote for personalities. And
that's right.
Yeah, and like that is so damning.
You give me a good 15-second TikTok dance, you throw your family in there, I like that guy.
Right?
That's the guy that I want to hang out with.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, going by those, it's all entertainment.
It is.
They have made the political a WWE wrestling
match. Well, that's
match.
the Chris Hedges. That's the I'm reading the book right now. Where he goes into the wrestling matches and he goes into it, the kayfabe culture.
Yeah. Are you talking Empire of
Illusion?
Yeah. Chris Hedges.
Yeah.
Which he goes right into it. And Matt Taibi wrote a book that I read this year. I can't remember the name, but he goes into depth about the similarities between wrestling and political punditry on MSNBC versus Fox News, and how they're just, it's
beautiful.
It's beautiful entertainment.
Well, think about how I think about it sometimes when I'm like, oh man, that's a crazy job. You show up 5 days a week and you have to talk about politics, and it's like, this is where the people tune in. This is the theater part. This is where it's like, and I do think there's a little bit of like, I mean, I think there's a realness to it. There is a real stakes to it. And I think that's the thing of people are so used to the policy not really being affected by who you elect or the voice of the people. I think it's radical that's kind of status quo. And then I also think that people make excuses as stuff goes on. So it's like, blah, blah, blah happens. Well, that person probably deserves it. Like, it's like really like kind of like, and it's an aggressive behavior, but it's back to this kayfabe idea of like, it's all acting. And so until it's not, it's actually not. And I think about stuff of like, January 6th, where there's still this fight to be like, hey, that was kind of a crazy thing. And I think for most people, when they're watching it on the news and they're seeing these people storm the Capitol, there's a little bit of it where they're like, well, that's crazy. Like, oh my gosh. Like, well, I gotta show up to work. Like, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And I think that's the thing of like, it doesn't mean anything until something like that happens again, and it's a little bit more intense and it's a little bit more direct, because this almost, I think of it as like this barrier's been broken in a way.
Yeah.
And it has been. I mean, I think we're not really, I think it's a lot of the stress comes from people not being allowed to deal in the reality that we're living in.
Right.
So it's like
they're living in a surreality, and there's a million instances of January 6th every single day. They're just not nearly as pronounced on the TV show that we're all engaged in right now.
Yeah. And so you're watching this thing unfold in a really slow motion way, where it's like when something really big happens, everyone's going to say, well, I didn't see it coming. And it's like, I do think those little pings of stress that people feel, the little, like, it's like there's something breaking that barrier of your reality, and there's something being let in that's really unpleasant, and you don't want it to be there. But like, you go somewhere that you're not really, that's not your comfort area, and it becomes a little bit more prevalent. And so I think that's what we're, as a country in general, dealing with, where you look at, I don't know, I think you just look at like corruption law, you look at espionage law, you look at the way that the Supreme Court's, handing power over to the executive branch. I wonder how much of it's structural, and it's like once you give that much power away and that much stuff is aligned, that something just tilts in an aggressive way, or how much of that is actually, people getting riled up or whatnot. I just think that it's an interesting development to see unfold, and for people to be so disconnected to it because they're so used to feeling revved up, to feeling like they're participating in a theater. But and I think that's all. And then eventually, when it's not theater, it's like reality. That type of reality really sucks.
No, and it's I think the January 6th thing was seeing the dream spill out into the open, and one heroic security guard turn in the right direction saved it from getting really ugly. But that is inescapable through our days.
It's also so funny to think about all these guys never having met before on like some 4chan QAnon board, be like, we're gonna do it. We're gonna freaking do it. And all it really took was someone to wave a wand and be like, hey, like, you guys aren't really about this, are you?
Right. But also like the sort of meetup version of it. It's like, we're going to leave our head. We're going to leave our glowing screen that we're staring at in our off hours. And that's what the Society of the Spectacle, which is the book I just read, and it takes place, he wrote it in the late 60s, but that's what he talks about, is like how the division of labor became projected into the visual world and into the way we're supposed to live our lives, and how like isolated you become.
I think visual world, I think it's like you get so entrapped into this narrative of like this little digital box matters, right? This little thing can, and it's there's a word for it where it's
I guess that was it. It was the meetup quality. The fact that you have been so isolated into this digital box, and then it's like, hey, no, now we're all going to meet up. And like the relief in actually being around other people, albeit in a very destructive manner.
How fun it is to be part of like a hooligans group, like a mob. Like I remember being in high school and like really starting like, school walkouts, like pretending that there's a fire in the chemistry lab when we had a fire drill, and like walking the kids out to, and it's like you get a group of like 40 kids and everybody's on the same exact mind frame. Like we're gonna really have fun with it. It starts spilling out, and I think that's the thing that people don't understand. There's a great This American Life podcast about a reporter that joins the football hooligans crew, and he's talking about them after the game spilling out, and they're causing a ruckus, and he's like, I'm getting kind of lost in the mosh pit, the mob mentality. He's like, I'm becoming not a person. I'm I'm blended into this. And then somebody picks up a rock and throws it through the other soccer team's bus window. And he's like, and when that glass shattered, it was like all hell broke out. And I was so happy to be there. It was so exciting. And I think that's the thing where the hangover of that is so, it's really insane. And the chase of that, it's like you really are getting into places where how many of those people who felt that mob mentality that first time are going around telling people like, you have no idea what that was like. That's what we need to do that again. Like we need to experience that type of connectivity. Like that's a really strong absent thing in America.
That's right.
That is it's like it really is like lighting a match where and it's really interesting to see that
unleashing a communal desire in such a pent up extreme way that it can only come out in these like sort of violent circumstances. Whereas like if you said, and it's so rare in America because it's like, if we were being humans, every day we would gather around the fire and we'd dance together and we'd tell stories and we'd sing and we'd work together to make our lives, better. And we're being individualized. You don't get that. So when you meet up, it's only under these like strange consumerist things. Oh, and that's what I wanted to mention about Society of the Spectacle. It's that even when you're off work, you're free of your labor, seemingly. You're not free. You're still guided by a world of that labor, and you're still interacting with that. And so you are still in it. And I know that thought came late to me.
No, it makes sense.
Okay, but it makes sense.
We and work is now the it's like we traded off, like we offshored all of these factory jobs. We basically were like, we're going to decimate, we're going to neoliberal the hell out of middle America. It's gonna be great for executives. And now it's like you show up to the email factory, and the thing about the email factory is that it's like you don't have to show up to it. It's like you get a call at 9 p.m. Somebody's expecting to talk to you. Like it's so funky. It's such a interesting trade-off of
so the actual work never leaves.
So now it's actually
always
ever
hovering.
constant. Well, that's the thing too. I don't think it's because I think that there's a little bit of an unhealthy version of like work-life balance where work is life fundamentally. Like I think that's like kind of the joyous thing about stuff is that you're working towards something, and it's like if you're not aligned fully on what you're doing for work, then it's like maybe you got to re-examine what you're doing. But I do think it's kind of funky that now the expectation is you're constantly on call.
By virtue of this technology that was supposed to free us. And suddenly, no, it didn't free us. It found us.
What?
Hey, have you guys noticed that? Your phone's kind of makes you available
I love that.
all the time.
I love that. I do think there's things that are just kind of common knowledge where it's like people are like, oh, yeah, I know my phone's like, they're like, oh, like my phone's listening to me. Or it's like, or it just really has like your algorithm so locked in. It knows everything about you and what you're going to do and what you want and what you're going to buy. And we're just like, we're spooked out by it, and then we're like,
well, whatever.
Cool.
Right. Hope you send me those pajamas that I'm looking for.
It's so.
I still haven't seen them.
But that's the thing. It's so there's such a complacency with it, where I'm like, and I think that's so systematic in a way where, you're in a world.
Well, is it complacent, or is it because that's where we go to get fed?
Well, that's where we go to get.
Like
we're like little pigs at the trough.
Yeah, if you were a baby calf and your mom's, the
teats in
the
an
teat.
iPhone.
I'm talking about the teat.
The teats,
regardless of which mammal you are. Yeah,
it's
and
like
okay, my direct deposit comes through on my phone.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be looking for that because I'm now at the grocery store.
Yeah, I need to make sure that my credit card's paid off, or I have $200 so I can pick up the right amount of food. Basically the dream is my goal. If I can help out, is go work for an AI company.
Oh boy!
Onboard a bunch of artists, steal all of their work,
yeah,
and then just throw people into Oculus Rifts or Apple Vision Pros and get them to do some like tap to earn game where I'm like, you just show up, you get like every time you tap or you provide some.
I mean,
it's
then
like,
we are the batteries in the matrix, right?
Yeah, I'm like, if you can, and the people, obviously people who have more followers and are better at generating purchase taps.
They get gruel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sweetened gruel. Yeah. That's nice. I like your vision. I mean, you're thinking ahead. You're like 2 years ahead.
I'm like, why would you need the outdoors if you could go to space?
You can see it. Well, isn't it interesting how VR, and I know Facebook's coming out with some new glasses that might do it finally, but like it hasn't caught on. And I honestly think it's just the physicality of putting something over your face and your head, and to where it's like when you're holding your phone, you still feel like you're steering that ship, even though it's completely steering me.
You are, I do think you are in a VR environment when you are on your phone.
Exactly.
I think it's like that reality is like that the digital domain is so present that it's like people think VR is like space-time travel, but it's like the experience of it, or you're going to be able to, like have all these. It's like really, it's like maybe a more direct way to access your Outlook, an easier way to do a Zoom meeting, so it feels a little bit more like you guys are actually getting coffee together. Like it's this. I don't know. There's a little piece of it where I'm like, the simplest thing is just go back to basics and like hit up your friend and be like, yo, like call somebody, be like, hey, how's it going? Like, let's go grab a bite.
Yeah. Simple as that.
Yeah.
But now when I'm on the phone, like with my brother talking shit, I'm like, I think Instagram's probably listening to this phone call too. So
well, we got
to get landlines.
That's the thing. Well, the thing about VR really fast that is actually it had like people. There are like hyper users of VR.
Oh, of course.
But I think that's always like an interesting fringe of, that guy that goes around, he's like, hey, nice car. What do you do for a living?
Yeah.
There's like a version of that where someone goes around like a VR environment and they're like, hey, what's the longest you've been in your VR headset for? People are like, I've been in here for like 72 hours once. And I'm like, that experience must be so amazing. Like to be like, oh, I'm going to lock myself into this imaginary world for 72 hours.
It's a drug experience.
Yeah.
Because it is just hitting all the chemicals.
Then
what's the grave depression when they take that headset off?
Yeah, I mean,
they face the world. And I mean, that's the thing. Before the internet, because of this production-based projection, reality was already a surreality, but now we've built a surreality on top of our surreality in the sense that like you're engaging with a marketplace and now a virtual marketplace. And you see people walking across the street now. It is now common to be staring at your phone crossing the street.
Yeah.
It used to be like, whoa, that's bad. And now it is
Doesn't
common.
That person know where they're going?
Yeah, and it's like socially acceptable. And if I walk past a stranger and they take out their phone to look at it, like a gun in a holster, I do the same. And I've started to notice, oh, yeah, we are still communal creatures who are aping each other's movements, but now it's happening in this sort of
have you ever been in a group of friends where it's like everyone's in a circle talking and then like maybe the most like compelling talker pulls out their phone to look and then like someone else pulls it out and then all of a sudden it's like four people
staring at their phones together
hanging
and
around.
Your heads just get closer and closer until you're all resting skulls on each other.
What I've been doing recently is when someone pulls out their phone in front of me is I just start looking at what they're doing. Just be like, oh, I thought this was a group. I want to group this with you.
That's the move. Yeah, we got to start finding ways to subvert them. I remember when like the basic cell phones came out, my mom thought it was so rude to text message her. Like that was like, how could you text me and not call me? Like I'm not worth a phone call anymore. And just how now my mom's dashing off emojis like it's no problem. It's like she's all over the gram and stuff. But it's like how far we've come. It's interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. But books bring us back.
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, it's its own form of, I guess it's its own form of like reality, its own form of virtualness. I think that's the thing. Well, that's the thing where I go with
And when I get in touch with you as a client after 9 p.m.,
That's fine.
I'm coming with the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, that's what I want.
It's not business.
I want that.
We're not talking business.
Hey,
I would never.
Are you ready for this?
And when I talk to you during business hours, it's not business. Yeah. No, I think just letting you know. But yeah, I don't know. It's the idea that like, okay, on your off day you go to a football game, but you're not off. You are still transacting in the marketplace. You are still rooting for a team that's been advertised to you since you were a kid. You were in the little jersey when you were a baby. Like, and don't get me wrong, I love a football game, but yeah, like that.
Yeah, there's a little bit of there. I love sports so much. So it's. I had a moment where I went to this weekend. I went to USC play Wisconsin. I'm a Wisconsin Badgers fan, and I didn't pull my phone out for the whole time. And I had a moment where I was like, maybe in the third quarter, where I was like, oh, I should post this on my Instagram story. And I was like, what? Why? Why would I? Why? What am I getting out of that? And I've been having that thought a lot about, I think because of the Chris Hedges influence, a little bit of the being like, damn, I'm really planning a blueprint for myself. I think AI scraping is really scary. I think the way of like how easy it is to clone someone's voice, clone someone's image, to make them do something that like, to make them say something. If I make anybody upset at this podcast, it wasn't me. I can say that now. Like, I'm like, no, that's actually,
that's absolutely,
they
AI
got me.
That conversation.
Yeah. And I think we're entering this really interesting time where it's like this digital presence of yourself used to be such a real thing.
Yeah.
And we're going to get to a place where I think we're already there, where it actually doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's so malleable that you can't take anything at face value, except what is entertaining you in that given moment or connecting to you. And yet that in and of itself is a manipulation.
Yeah. Where I'm also like, and I had a moment where I'm like, man, I wish I'm such a little physical media head more and more, and I have done absolutely nothing about it, where I'm like, God, physical media would be great to have. How nice would it be to have a DVD? But then I was like, why, like, why not take like, get my pictures developed and put it in a little binder so that I can, how much more tangible is that? How much more respectful of a moment is that than throwing it up? And then it becomes such a grind about being like, oh, I hope people like that one.
Yeah. Well, it's,
yeah.
No, my wife brought her photo album out the other day just randomly and sat next to me and showed me her childhood photos. And it was a moment. It was real. And like in the 70s and 80s, they would like, families would go on vacation and they'd take Super 8 film of it, and then they'd invite their friends over and set up the projector and be like, hey, watch our projector, watch our footage from the vacation or our Kodak slides. And that's what Instagram was the digital version of. But now it's a manic, overcharged, assault of imagery and video that doesn't ever end. Like, at least when you went to your neighbor's house, you're like, okay, I'll have a couple beers, but we'll be out of here by 9:30 to put the kids to bed. And now it doesn't end. 9:30, you're just getting started with the scroll. Yeah.
Wait for all the sketch comedy you're going to get in between, like, fried takes in between.
As I panic over what my next one will be.
I know. But it's also, but I think that's the thing, too, where I'm looking at it more as it's like, I guess it's such a tool for business.
Yeah, it's a self-promotion tool.
And if you're not using it for that, then it's like, maybe you should figure out a different way to make memories with it.
That's
and I think it's such a, I don't know, it's so tough.
And I think a lot of people have stopped. I mean, I've been talking about that in my stand-up, is like, there are no one my age posts anymore. Yeah. Unless they're trying to sell you something, whether it's real estate or they're divorced and they're trying to get laid again, or whatever. Or me making my comedy videos, I'm selling my words, whatever.
You are. And there's money that there's literally, it's like you do it the right way.
It's a commercial. As genuine as I want to be, as sincere as I want to be in what I'm making, it's like it's inescapable from the medium, which is a commercial medium. Yeah. But so at Joshua Turek, at Turek Books. But that's what's cool about podcasts. It sort of feels like it slipped out to this like little side stream of like, no, you can still find me here. And it's not algorithmic. It's just, this is where we are having a conversation. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's also this interesting thing where I was listening to this ex-CIA operative talking about like Russia and Ukraine. And he was like, you really got to be careful. It's like, you have to understand everything is coming from somebody's point of view. Everything is, there's a think tank somewhere that has decided, hey, this is our stance on it, or this is how we're going to run the PR from this. And so it's like, you have these really amazing tools at giving you a semblance of where you're at already, and they will most likely drag you more into that thought process. And so
to achieve their aims.
And it's fun because I think it's fun to exist in that platform subversively in some way, to be like, what's the reprieve? What's the little bit of like a deep breath, or that's a funny take, or hey, like that is right. Like paying rent sucks. Like, I just think it's not, it's like, there's a real, people have been fighting the system for a really long time, and they've been losing for a really long time. And I just don't know if you should be, I think there's a lot of people that are diehards about it, but I'm like, I don't think fighting the system works. I think it's kind of, I think you have to figure out how to live your life without the system in a way.
Right. You mean fighting the system through the system's tools only strengthens the system?
Yeah. I think being completely adversarial to the system is not a good offboarding ramp for people. I think if somebody sees somebody being like, anti-popular policy on their feed or in their story, they're just kind of like, okay, cool. Like, I don't even think it sticks to people anymore.
Yeah, that's what I wonder.
I don't think thoughts stick to people the same way that it's like, and it goes back to that thing of, you don't even know, because it's like, you don't even know, you don't know fully, there's no way to know the context of anything anymore, because it's been stripped away, purposely stripped away.
Yeah.
And there's no interested voice in people. It's legislated away. So you're living in an environment where it's like, unless you have a shit ton of money, or unless you own a big corporation, or unless you're on the board of a big corporation, unless you're, working deep in the bureaucracies of government, you don't really get power. You're lucky enough to live in this, like this system. And I don't think it's I'm a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to knocking on the door and being like, we got to do something. Because I think the train is in motion, and it's been speeding up for the last 100 years, 50 years. I mean, two different things. And
there's thousands of nuclear warheads on the train.
Yeah. And I think we're just like, I think we just got to figure out,
and
like,
the conductor's in a VR headset.
Yeah. He's eating oatmeal thinking it's caviar.
I feel that. I do feel that pessimism, in the sense that I don't even think the average person wants things differently.
But I think it's like an internal thing. I think it's like you have to be like, well, where are you helping out? What are you doing in your day-to-day life of, like, I don't know. I find a lot of joy in bus riding and biking, and like not using cars as a transportation, because I have all of these little moments with people who like live in the city, and then I'm like, oh, I'm part of something that's interesting, or I see somebody that needs help, and I can be like, hey, do you need help? And it's such a immediate, gratifying thing on such a real, weird, fundamental level that I don't get driving around. And I'm like, well, that's a little bit, if more people biked, in my head.
Yeah.
I'm like, maybe some people would be more happy.
Truly.
And it's maybe if people were
just rebuilding the human fabric.
Yeah.
Through like, these are radical acts, I say now, riding your bike.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, but it's radical because it just makes you feel happy.
Yeah.
And you don't need a driver's license, and you don't need to pass a test, and you don't need to register your bicycle yet.
Yeah.
When enough people do,
They will be.
yeah.
You have to register your bike in Orange County.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Just a regular bicycle?
I think so, yeah.
Wow.
Um,
Okay, well, so what?
Yeah. But I do think but I go back to that where I'm like, what are those? I think people they want to chew off this big thing.
Well, and you said it at the beginning of the conversation. You said the revolution starts within,
Yeah.
right? Like that's your premise.
Yeah, exactly. And people want to so badly chip away at it and point at stuff and be like, oh, that's awful what they're doing. And I'm like, that is the status. That is the game. That is the way that it has been, that it is set up institutionally on a really crazy deep level. And I think it's really difficult to think about pulling away from that in a meaningful way.
Right. You're saying to change the world, start your own little game.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're so right.
Yeah.
Start on a local level. Yeah, Drew rides the bus and he rides the bike and we talk about it.
Yeah.
We share notes, and it really is you are seeing the world from street level in a totally different way. I say, look, not everyone's life is set up where they live or through their job
do the biking.
To do the biking.
Yeah.
Because you may haul heavy equipment, whatever the case may be. And I'm with it, but if you do have the chance, especially this week, because this is like a car-free week that they're trying to promote.
Yeah.
I don't know what the name of it is exactly, National Car-Free Week. But yeah, give yourself a day, give yourself an afternoon to go try it. And
or I always think of like, if you have, I think there's a lot of people that live walking distance to like a store or a restaurant that they get Uber Eats from. And it's like they get food delivery from, and I'm like, try just showing up. Try being like, I'm gonna go see if a friend wants to grab a bite with me instead of like isolating myself.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, I love living where I live because I've like now met everybody in my town. Like I know everybody who works everywhere, and like I know what bars they go to after. And you run into somebody like, oh, I haven't seen you in 3 weeks. And like, oh, I hurt my back slipping in a pool. And I'm like, oh my God. And you have actual catch ups. And I think on that front of it, if I was going to promote anything on this podcast, I would promote my official Playa del Rey page.
Yeah. You had me thinking it. Drew lives in the sleepy seaside town of Playa del Rey, which is kind of near LAX airport.
Yeah, right near LAX.
And yeah, you started official Playa del Rey Instagram, and it's just local content. It's gentle, it's functional, it's you're kind of micro journaling.
I think that's the thing of like, oh, and it's funny the interactions you get in the DMs where people want you to like take a stance on issues, but you're like, not really the place for it. But I will promote a local business. Happy to do that. And I think but I also think that's like, what's a subversive way of using something where it's like, oh, it's funny you go into this digital world to explore all this stuff, and then to be like, oh, that's where I live. That's
you're not even self-promoting, you're community promoting.
Yeah.
Which is like selfless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is subversive in doing it that way.
And so it's just like, okay, here's a cool thing. Here's a new restaurant opening up. But then like, here's like a couple fishermen trying to catch things.
Yeah, and that's the real stuff. Well, we're now looking down at the book you brought.
The one book I brought.
Yeah, I'm curious about this book.
I brought a fiction book. There's one guy who has given me pretty much amazing book recs, Daniel McDonald, who I don't know, he's crushed it on it. But Welcome to Hard Times is a Western, and I like Westerns. That's kind of it.
Great. Yeah.
It's great.
First few years of my life, I wore a cowboy hat everywhere I went.
Did you really?
I insisted on it, yeah.
First when?
Like when I was like 2 to 4 years old, and I'd cry if I didn't have my cowboy hat, and I loved the Lone Ranger, so I'm very much in that mode. I don't know what it is, just probably the horses and the cool outfits, not the colonialism.
what?
Yeah.
Come again?
Yeah.
There's another book that I got recommended from Dan McDonald, Islands of Abandonment, where there's a section in it that's 3 pages long talking about Lewis and Clark traveling across, and the mythology of it is that it's untouched wilderness.
Right.
It's beauty. And the reality of it is it's like, 90 to 95% of the native population had just died from disease brought over by settlers. And what they were walking through was post-apocalyptic.
The remnants of civilization.
Yeah. And and that book starts with, I'm blanking on the author's name, but she's sitting in Chernobyl with the Geiger counter ticking. And she's like, this place is so beautiful, but this reader is telling me there are invisible particles traveling through my body. And if I stay here too long, I'll get cancer. And there's such a dynamic between what feels like we're racing towards some sort of, like we have to, there's something of like humans thinking that we're bigger than nature, but nature more than likely will always win.
Yeah.
We're temporary more than nature is.
Absolutely. I just read Dead Cities by another one by Mike Davis, and you talking about Chernobyl. He mentions how the nuclear testing that was done in the west of the United States was like the radiation and the fallout from it was like more damaging than Chernobyl. We have this idea of Chernobyl because it was like a little more dramatic.
Yeah.
A nuclear reactor failed, but nuclear bombs didn't fail, and they decimated a lot of indigenous communities, but communities far and wide through Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona. And that idea of colonialism continuing to like destroy nature is ever present.
Ever present.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what this book encapsulates, a little bit of that, because it's a town. It starts off as a town. I love a good fiction. It's hard for me to jump into it. So someone needs to sit me down and say, hey, you need to read this.
Okay.
And if they really are passionate about it, I'll do it. Usually my reading appetite is nonfiction, which is so lame, I think.
Yes and no.
I just wish I was more of a...
No, there's just so much you want to know.
Yeah. And I'm like, what do I do with that knowledge? I'm like...
True. Well, you try to solve the world when you sit down with your friend. And then you walk away going, yep, glad we figured that out.
I'm like, I'm really stressing out right now. This book is not doing anything good for me.
Just missed my bus again.
But this is such a good tie-in because it starts off as a guy living in a western town that has a bad man roll through, and the guy is such a force of nature. Comes in, he kills people, he burns it down, and everybody is everyone decides to leave, except for this ragtag group of people led by one man. And it's all about the trials and tribulations of trying to strike it rich in the West and trying to build a city, and how nature's unrelenting, and even in success there's tragedy. And it's a very American novel. It got me.
Well,
Welcome
you're
to Hard
talking about
Times.
nature being unrelenting in that Mike Davis Dead Cities book. He has this great chapter toward the end where he's talking about how like nature is always attempting to reclaim your city. Yeah. And it's sprouting up through little gaps in the sidewalk. It's the tree roots are mangling your plumbing.
Yep.
Like it's an ongoing battle, and it's it's active from both sides. And I take great comfort in that idea.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
It's nice to think that way. It's nice to know that it's always moving. It's also stuff is so recent in American history. Like I don't know when this is supposed to be, but it's like this is not more than 150 years ago.
Yeah. A few generations.
I'm like, fuck, dude, we could have been cowboys.
Yeah, or we could have just,
hung out.
We could have hung out. We could have left people alone. We could have been in where we probably,
Yeah, I'm getting my Irish citizenship. I'm going back to my country.
Okay, and you're gonna go back, or it's just nice to have?
I think it's nice to have.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe I'll go back.
Maybe I'll go card back in your pocket in a poker game that is the Western world.
Yeah. Whatever. Civil War. I'm not sticking around for that.
No, not for that. Yeah, I don't. I'm not fighting for either side that's setting itself up. If a third side sets up, I don't know. We'll talk. But
what side would that be?
That'd be like the hey, let's all ride bicycles side.
It's Mad Max.
It's
Everyone's
Mad Max,
driving cars except for you on your bike
in the sand. Oh boy, the revolution is harder than I thought it would be. Yeah,
dressed as you are now with everyone else.
Oh yeah,
losing their shit.
Yeah, no, not trying to.
I think it's so. I don't know. I think I'm fascinated by the levers of government. I'm fascinated by the legislation that's come into play, and then I think the stuff that you can take control of is like your inner world and making sure that you're sound, and I do think a little bit of like the quest for understanding. The more I've gotten into like reading a Supreme Court brief is more about to be like, what are those guys doing? And then I do think there's a little bit of it where there's this self-importance put on stuff where there's a self-importance or even a cultural importance where you're like, these guys are just like they're doing it right in front of you. They're getting away with it. And it's fun to watch. I think I get a little bit of joy where I look inside of it and I'm like, wow, this is such a people organization. It's just people at the end of the day.
Oh, and I mean, they've got America split perfectly. It comes down to a few thousand votes each year. It's like, but there's also that part of enjoyment that I'm guilty of too. It's a programmed irony, because when you've been delivered as much information and people have said the quiet parts out loud and you've acknowledged the fact that you're largely powerless in it, the response is to make jokes because that's all you can do, you think. But, beyond that irony, the question is, well, I don't know. Are there ways of building community that are a little more sincere and stuff? If we're talking like a cause and effect, how do we solve problems?
I think, mentality.
Exactly. But if we're just like going through our day trying to,
there's also a thing. I mean, but I guess that's where my thing is, where I kind of look at it, where I go, I guess there's a little part of me where I'm like, well, people can't. It's like if someone wrote, you take a new Lewis Powell that writes another 40-page document illustrating how to get like humanities back into government, and we've lost touch with people, and here are the steps that we need to take and the type of propaganda machine we need to cultivate and how we have to get. It's like maybe that's all it takes is somebody to write a 40-page thing and send it to the right people and get people whipped into the same line, because it is a person structure, and it's maybe.
And that is my hope still with the internet, is that even if we're just nudging things forward, we can infiltrate it with ideas that speak to imagining a better world. And there's some things that we know through those ideas that like our parents' generation didn't catch wind of during their prime years. So that's where my hope is. It's like, everyone write your mission statement. And it could fall flat like Jerry Maguire's. And I don't know if you ever saw that movie. Yeah, he writes his mission statement. And Drew Shenfield, I think we did it again. I think we got a little closer to figuring out the world. Official Playa del Rey on Instagram.
Follow it.
But thank you.
Let me hit stop record on all.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to another episode of Turek Books. Be sure to like, subscribe, thumbs up, any kind of thing that could help us get listened to or watched by more people. We really appreciated having you and hope to see you again next week with a new guest and plenty of books. Take care until then.